something I experienced is that sometimes when you're speaking about other people's experiences and other people's microaggressions, it's easier for you to spot them or to recognize them. But when it's your own, I find doubting myself more. Like maybe it's not that. Maybe I'm exaggerating. Maybe I'm reading it wrongly. And that's quite interesting because the theory and the practice actually sometimes, you struggle a little bit more to give yourself the power on saying, don't doubt yourself. This is happening right now to you and it's important. It's not because it's you that is less important.
Hi, my name is Nadia Nagamutu, business psychologist, coach, speaker, and founder of Avenir Consulting, which creates organisational growth and success via inclusion and diversity. We've been discussing the benefits that diversity brings to companies' bottom line performance for decades with more and more evidence. But there are so many questions organisations still have about how to achieve it. How do you create a culture where people feel valued for their uniqueness and the qualities they bring? I believe it's crucial to the future success and sustainability of every organisation that they find the answer to this question to make sure that each employee is not only supported but also appreciated. With this podcast, I aim to get some of the key challenges to creating inclusive workplaces out in the open and start uncovering the solutions to embracing a culture that cares for everyone. I'm going to be having conversations with some of the most inspiring people in different countries and across industries who are pushing the boundaries on inclusion and diversity in the workplace, from topics such as parenting in the workplace, ethnicity, age, gender, mental health, and all things inclusion. I want to create a movement to change society through sharing life experiences and creating more empathy and connection. Why care? I believe that once we have organisations and societies that accept and value everyone for who they are, we become healthier, happier, and better in our roles, both inside and outside work. Hello, and welcome to episode 13 of my Why Care podcast. My name is Nadia Nagamutu, and I am your host. In this episode, I speak to Marta Pajón-Fustes, Head of Technical and Inclusion and Diversity at Innocent. She joined the company in 2009 as an ingredients technologist and has seen Innocent grow into a global business. Marta works alongside Innocent's people team and other senior leaders from across the company to make inclusion and diversity a business priority. Marta discusses her personal experience of microaggressions and some of the challenges of being a Spanish native living and working in the UK. She shares Innocent's 5 core principles for inclusion and diversity and how they have created a clear and measurable action plan. We discuss how to challenge a culture fit mentality, some best practice examples of inclusive recruitment, how to best utilise affinity groups, overcoming backlash, scaling up inclusion and diversity in a fast growth company, and much, much more. It's a packed show. Enjoy. Hello, Marta. It is wonderful to have you on the Why Care podcast show. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Nadia. Really, really nice to be here.
I'm super excited to talk to you about all things diversity and inclusion from a personal perspective, but also obviously working at Innocent, also to find out a little bit more about what Innocent's doing in this space. So first up, I would love to know your journey. Now, everyone's got a journey, some story to tell, how they came into diversity and inclusion, and I'd love to hear yours.
I guess I can split it probably in my personal as well as my professional journey. So from a personal perspective, I think I've always been quite an active feminist, but I don't think that's where it comes from more strongly. I think what drove me the most to be involved on this is my personal experience in social mobility. So I am from a very small village in the north of Spain, and I had the luxury of living in such a small place, which meant that we all went to the same school. We all had a much more similar experience than maybe when you're in a bigger city. I'm the proud daughter of a truck driver and a stay-at-home mom, and they had 4 kids, and they had enough support and enough opportunities to give us, the 4 of us, actually the opportunity to get a degree and study and have a career. And I realized that should always be the case, that I wish everyone had those opportunities, but it's really difficult to get that. I guess that's probably the personal area that connected me more with inclusion and diversity. From a professional perspective, I became part of the leadership team at Innocent a few years ago. And as part of my initial formal role, technical, quality and food safety, human rights was a strong element of my role. At Innocent, the way we approve suppliers is not only from a quality, food safety perspective, but also for their structures in terms of human rights, social and environmental tools and systems. And I guess finally, as part of the leadership team, I also had the experience of leading by example. So I was able to implement on my own team tools and things that I thought that the full business should. For example, in terms of job shares, I had the first job share that existed at Innocent, but not only that, also the first job share that actually got promoted. So the two women sharing the role decided to go for a promotion together and went through the promotion as a job share.
And you were one of that pair?
No, I was hiring for that role. So they were part of my team and they were applying for a role within my team.
And so tell me, I'm really curious, was there any conversation as a leadership team about how this would work? Like, was there any hesitation about this job sharing possibility and promoting two people at the same time to job share in that way?
I don't think there was hesitations. I think there was a recognition that there will be things to think about and there will be things to change or to adapt or to make sure that we gave the right tools and the right opportunities for them to succeed. So obviously, for a starter, the recruitment process, how do you do the recruitment? Do you do interviews with both of them together? You do a separate? So we kind of created as we went how the promotion process, how the recruitment process for that role will work. And we did it together, as in I did it as the person who was recruiting, but also the two people that was applying. We make sure that it worked for me and the business, but it worked for them as well. And they succeed.
And so how did you do it? Did they interview together or separately?
Both. So we had a separate interview process for each of them, but we also had a session where we work together on how the role will work, how the responsibilities will be split in a way that we get the biggest benefit for both of them, as well as for the team they were leading, because it was a leadership role. So they will become the leader of one of the teams in my function.
That's really fascinating because typically you might recruit as a job share, but actually promotion as a job share is another thing, because what if one individual is more ready than the other individual? That sort of interdependency on their careers, which is a really interesting dynamic.
It was very, very interesting. And it was a perfect example as well of how the value of different perspectives. I think a job share not only brings the opportunity for people that wants or needs more flexibility at work, but also it's a great opportunity for me to have a job share in my team. I'm having two brains instead of one.
Absolutely.
And two perspectives instead of one. And they are going to support each other and they're going to challenge each other. And we're going to probably get to a better solution having two people getting there than only one.
I love that perspective, particularly for the manager who's managing the job share people. It's so often the focus of the negatives, of the downsides, the extra work of having to performance manage two people, of trying to figure out where are they at? What if one of them goes on holiday? What happens with the other? The extra work, the extra cognitive effort it takes to manage two people rather than one. And so I love that gain as a result. What a wonderful story. I'm interested now, you've spoken about your upbringing in Spain. You came over here, obviously, to UK. You've been living in the UK for a number of years right now.
Yes, I think I lost track. I think 14, 15.
Yeah.
I think I lost track already.
Yes. I'm curious about whether you experienced any challenges coming into the UK throughout your working life in the UK, about any bias or any microaggressions, or if you don't like that term, as some people don't, then subtle acts of exclusion, or anything that you felt, actually, this is making me feel like I don't belong here.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I guess the first thing to mention is I try to be mindful and aware of the privilege I have. That's the reality. I'm white. The color of my skin has given me a lot of privilege throughout my life. And I'm from a Western European country. So I have lots of privilege that I've been having throughout my life. But yes, you're right. Like different cultures also bring you different kind of situations. And I don't know what your experience, Nadia, is, or the people that is listening to us today, but something I experience is that sometimes when you're speaking about other people's experiences and other people's microaggressions, it's easier for you to spot them or to recognize them. But when it's your own, I find doubting myself more, like maybe it's not that, maybe I'm exaggerating, maybe I'm reading it wrongly. And that's quite interesting because the theory and the practice actually sometimes, you struggle a little bit more to give yourself the power on saying, don't doubt yourself. This is happening right now to you and it's important. It's not because it's you that is less important. And yes, I have experienced like one that comes to my head quite often when I've asked that is, it's a silly thing, but it's an example. I was playing a game with people that I didn't know much and was quite a social situation, nothing important. And some of them started cheating and started cheating like in quite a visible way, in a jokey, visible way, not in a dodgy manner. And someone was getting quite annoyed by that. And there was a little bit of tension. And I tried to avoid that tension. I tried to be a bit like, come on, it's okay, doesn't matter. And the reaction back, and this was an English person, the reaction back was, look, Marta, maybe in your country, that is okay. Maybe you guys are okay with that. But here, we don't like cheating.
Ooh.
And that really felt, and I didn't react much. I just let it go. I let it go. And if you tell me that story, I will be like, oh, you let it, but why you let it go? But when it's yourself, and this is many years ago, I don't know if I will let it go nowadays.
It brings me back. There's a high school moment, and we were tasked as a group of us to go. I don't know why. There was some important thing going on in the school, and we had to go to the supermarket and buy and prepare some things to offer a spread of food for these people who were coming into the school. Again, it's something so small, but it is stuck with me. So we were slicing cheese, okay? And the way that my parents cut cheese, and when they're giving it as little sort of snacks, is they used to cube them. Maybe that's the way in Mauritius they used to serve it. In Mauritius, there was this kind of processed cheese block that they used to buy because they didn't get the fresh milk, because in Mauritius, there aren't any cows. Okay, so they're importing cheese. It's all processed cheese, long life cheese, basically. And so they'd cube them. And so I got this block of cheddar, and they said, oh, can you cut up the cheese? And I diced it. I put it into small little chunks. And then halfway through, one of my friends sort of turned around to me and was like, Nadia, what are you doing with that cheese? And I was like, I just froze. I was like, because for me, I was like, I'm cutting the cheese, right? And then they all stopped and they all looked at me, and she was like, you're cubing the cheese. And they all laughed. And I had no clue. I didn't understand what I had done that would provoke laughter. I just felt stupid. And because it had never crossed my mind to slice this cheese. It never crossed my mind. I was 17 and I'd never prepared food for buffet style before. And everything I know is from my home, which is my parents used to cube it. So.
And it's the complexity of course, they laugh without any bad intention. It wasn't anything that they will connect with anything, but the feeling that leaves you inside is quite different, isn't it?
I'm 17, I'm now 40, right? And I still remember that moment. But for sure, there are times, even relatively recently, where it's happened and I haven't said anything. It's a really interesting conversation, because what would you say now to that individual if you were to have that moment again?
First of all, I would probably be curious to understand what it is that made her think that, like what it is from the perspective that people may have from Spain or from Spanish people that make her feel that cheating may be more acceptable in my country. I think that curiosity of the beginning, because it's easy to get annoyed and angry by it and just kind of block it out. But I will try to understand what it is that is being said or understood about Spain that will make her feel that way, and have that opportunity of the open conversation about it. Because that's one of the things I also learned through my journey on inclusion and diversity, how important it is to have those conversations. And 10 years ago, I will probably be much more defensive. 10 years ago, I would probably be a bit more kind of attacking or more difficult to listen to the other perspective. But I want to believe that now I have a little bit more of capacity to try to stop myself from reacting like that and be curious. Why? What is it that made you think like that? So that I can reply back with what maybe the reality or my experience of what being Spanish or living in Spain actually is.
And I love that word, capacity, that you have more capacity potentially now through practice, through working in this space. And a lot of the times when I'm facilitating sessions with individuals, and I think all of this comes down to building a capacity, building this ability to navigate our emotions, that initial defensiveness or anger or frustration over someone who has clearly categorized us or boxed us into, well, clearly all Spanish people are like this, and all, which is so frustrating, and to not be sucked into that closed-mindedness and with them, and actually to allow yourself to be lifted up into curiosity, to bring them into a space where they can be open-minded and go, actually.
Exactly, because the other thing for me is when you get involved on inclusion and diversity, it's very easy that you ended up having always the same conversations with the same people. So people that is curious about it, interested on it. Of course, it's great to speak with each other and learn from each other. But what we're going to give the biggest benefit is to bring other people into the conversation and to give them the safety of being able to give their perspective and their opinions. So the conversation and the discussion can start. We can share the different perspectives and we can bring people to act on these topics and understand more of these topics. Speaking about it with the people that is already there, it's not going to make a big change. It's bringing other people into the conversation that will.
Yes. Let's bring this to Innocent then, because you've told me, and I understand from all Innocent's brand, that people culture that Innocent has, it prides itself on, what does that mean for a company like Innocent to have a people culture?
I guess I could speak for hours to answer this conversation. So Nadia, probably you're going to have to stop me on the answer on this question. So the way I will describe it is, first of all, the business is not the business and the people that works in the business. So Innocent is not the leadership, or Innocent is not the brand. Innocent is the people who works there. So I am Innocent. I'm part of Innocent. And creating a culture where people feels that way when things are, if something is not done in the right way, people feels, oh, this is me, this is my company, I'm going to do something about it, I need to help to make things better, versus having that feeling of company versus people. That's one of the things that I think I would describe as a people culture. I think another thing is in terms of the values. We have 5 values as a company, and it's not just things that we use for employer brand or to communicate. We use them for promotion processes. We use them for recruitment. We use them for performance. When you're assessing the performance mid-year at the end of the year with your manager is not only reviewing what you have done, they are also reviewing how you have done it and how the way you have worked is actually matching with the Innocent values, with the values of the company. So that's, I think, another reflection of being a people culture. And an example, but it's something that really stuck with me. You will, of course, Nadia, have seen all the news about companies now giving leave for pregnancy loss, which is great to see and great to hear. At Innocent, we were doing that, but we were doing that in the informal way that we work as a company. And I can share my own experience. I went through a pregnancy loss while I was working at Innocent, and I can share that I told my manager very soon because, again, he creates that environment for me of safety. And my manager knew at 5 weeks, I think it was 4 or 5 weeks, right before almost anyone else in my life, because I was not feeling great with the pregnancy. And I felt that will impact the way, I don't know, I wasn't feeling good. So speaking with him and answering the, how are you? And answering, I'm fine. It just didn't work with me. And I had enough safety on the relationship to share that. And then when the loss came, of course, his reaction was, take the time you need, whatever you need, you have it. So that was happening. But then with all this news that was happening recently of companies formalizing that, a colleague of mine who also went through pregnancy loss actually contacted the people team that we call it HR and said, guys, do our documents say that? And on the day she contacted them, the reply back was like, oh, you're right. No, they don't mention it, but they do now.
That's the benefit of maybe a smaller entity that can be more agile. Is it?
Yes, I think we are growing now. We are a European company now. I'm scared not to say the number of people because I will probably say it wrong, but I think we are around the 600 people, something like that. And one of the things that we really have to be mindful of, we speak a lot at Innocent about stay little as we go big. And this is the kind of things that we mean. So how do we create a company that even if it becomes bigger and bigger, this culture is still there? Because obviously the bigger you become, the more you probably have to formalize it and document it. So how do we find that balance of keeping that culture without having to every single thing explain it and mention it, so that we actually spread that culture across the business? That's one of the challenges with the growth, yes.
Absolutely, because one of the challenges is when you're working in the space of diversity and inclusion, and to do it well within an organization, there needs to be some empowerment of managers, of leaders, to be able to understand individual needs and say, this policy is great, I'm glad we have it, but actually it needs to be applied in a slightly different way for this person compared to this person. And it's only through that agility, that ability for leaders to go, I can make this change in one day, today, in fact, let's do it. It doesn't have to go like a million miles up, wait 10 days or 10 years for this decision to be made in order to then give you the tick of approval. Yes, go for it. So that's possibly a challenge as you grow then, is to maintain that level of autonomy at the local decision-making level.
Absolutely. But not only for leaders and managers to know that they can do it, it's also for everyone to know they can ask for it. So one of the challenges, I think, as well, is how you communicate so that people knows it's okay, that people knows that there is not a need for a document to say that they can do X, Y, and Z for them to be able to do it. One of the things Innocent has been focusing a lot through the pandemic, for example, is of this message of taking care of yourself and others. So we've been focusing a lot inside the business to say, it's difficult time. We all need things differently. We don't know what we need because it's new for everyone. So whatever you're struggling with, and we have a very strong mental health offering anyway before the lockdown, but that message of whatever you need, just say. There is nothing out of option here. If you're struggling and you need to go out and spend a couple of hours out and come back in, all of that flexibility has always been there, but you have to really repeat it and repeat it for people to really believe you, and lead by example. So people that is more on leadership positions demonstrate themselves, that they may leave the office at 3 p.m. and they don't have to explain the reasons behind that. So yes, over communicate that that's the case, lead by example, demonstrate that you're not only saying it, you're doing it.
And that's the thing, especially when it comes to diversity inclusion, or any policy, really, HR related policy, that I think many organizations feel, well, we've written it down, people should know what they can do, right? And actually that isn't the case. You're so right that it just needs to be repeated and emphasized and role modeled, for sure. So I'm interested then in this tension that can often be created around how do we maintain that people culture, that people element, and get the right people that can deliver the values in the way that we want our values to be delivered and executed, but also have diversity in the people that we're bringing in who might not do it the same way. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, that is one of the challenges, isn't it? This idea of culture fit versus culture add. So how do we ensure that we look at the culture of Innocent and we recognize that that's created for every member of the business? It's not that we have a set culture that everyone that joins has to adapt to that. And I think it's a great point to discuss about, because values are a great tool for a business and the culture of a business if used in the right way. Values can also be actually an excuse for being exclusive. And I gave you an example. One of the innocent values is entrepreneurial. You could read that in the wrong way and assess, oh, well, this person who doesn't add much into the conversations and it doesn't really seems to come with the first ideas and be an active member of the business. Maybe they are not really entrepreneurial enough. Maybe they are not adapting to the values. And what that person may be is someone that needs to be a bit more reflective, someone that is a little bit more introverted, and the way they communicate their ideas is a little bit initially seen as passive, but not that. It's just that the way they do it. So that's just a little example of how important it is to recognize values and behaviors in a way that they are indeed inclusive. Being inclusive is one of our values. So how do we make sure that those values are used as a tool and not as a threat for diversity is really important. But, natural, entrepreneurial, generous, commercial, responsible. I cannot think about any characteristic or any background or any personality that couldn't have of those 5 values. That should not be a limitation. And if it is that we are reading them wrong and that we have to really understand what they really mean.
It's a challenge, isn't it, to get that consistent approach. And for those recruiting managers who are potentially hesitating because they're not quite sure if they're the right fit, if they're going to do it the way that I'd like them to do it versus are they going to do it the innocent way? What is the innocent way and how can we evolve with that? So do you offer any guidance to leaders in what do you do to support them in that journey to help them understand what inclusion means?
Yeah, so there are simple and more complex tools that we try to use. One of the simple ones that I always think about is asking yourself, what is this person going to add? So if you're going through a recruitment process, instead of that idea of how could they fit into the company, is that question of what will this person bring? How could they add into the culture of innocence, into the way we do things? Just by doing that subtle change of fit versus add will probably put your mind on what is the different perspective that this person is bringing. Another important one is templates and processes are there for a reason. I know it sounds boring and too structured, but templates and processes really help with bias. So if you go to an interview and you ask exactly the same questions to different candidates, there is that less risk, of course, of the conversation to just click more for the people that is more similar to you. And it's human, right? Like if I'm asking questions for an interview and the person is giving me the answers that I will give, of course that's going to sound more right to me. It's like, well, they're saying what I would say, so that must be correct, versus actually they may say exactly what I would say because it's my affinity bias. We have a very similar experience. We come from a similar background. So what it is that I'm actually looking for in that answer is an important question to ask.
Yeah. And do you have any challenge mechanism apart from the question of value add as opposed to sort of the fit? Do you have any way of challenging thinking around that as part of your recruitment process?
Another important part of the recruitment process is what we call the challenge. So using a case of what can happen inside the business once you are in the role, a real case, so something that actually could have happened before, and ask the person to solve that. Because one of the problems as well with the typical scenario challenge in interviews is if you design it, you may design it with your own biases. You need to use something that actually has happened as a scenario of something that this person will have to do as part of the role. So how will you solve this problem? And the problem probably doesn't have a right or wrong answer, just different perspectives. So looking at how the different perspective of the answer to that challenge can bring a different way of doing things inside the business.
So affinity groups, they're incredibly popular. Many organizations have, whether it's ERGs or resource groups or affinity groups, whatever the name that they use for them. What's your view on them? Are they valuable? And to what extent, I suppose, on the flip side, could they promote us versus them as opposed to a collective we? Because through affinity groups, we kind of put people into boxes like this, the women's network and the ethnic network or the Muslim network. They're incredibly popular. I understand the value in them. I'm just interested in your views, really, on how that again, another tension.
Absolutely. And I can see why people will think about that. Are we boxing people? Are we actually separating instead of uniting? Actually, quite recently, my colleague Giovanna Cucci, which is working with me on inclusion and diversity, was mentioning how in a webinar that she went to, how the affinity groups increase the feeling of belonging amongst all employees, not only the ones that actually are part of the affinity group, because they lead to more openness and better conversations. But I guess you're asking me more from my perspective. And I think from my own perspective and at Innocent, the first thing we need to recognize is that we are not on a level playing field. So if we were in a level playing field, we will see the diversity characteristics across the business matching what is out there. So that's a fact. We are not in a level playing field. Things are different for different people with different backgrounds. And therefore, the potential opportunity of having extra support and extra opportunities for hearing specific voices will help to level that playing field. From another side, selfishly, from the work I'm doing, it really helps me out as well, because having the affinity groups inside the business helps people that joins them not only to identify maybe those feelings of inclusion. Like, they're not going to generate it. Creating affinity groups is not going to generate exclusion. It's not going to make them feel excluded. It's going to give them an opportunity to speak between them and say, well, I felt this way, I felt that way, share experiences. Hopefully with that, they will identify things that maybe the business is not doing quite right. And therefore, they can tell me that. They can tell me, Marta, this plan that you have on inclusion and diversity, you're missing this point, or this is not quite working for us because of these things that we have experienced. And not only they will hopefully give that tool of connecting between them or between each other and having the identification of this inclusion, but also the power of raising their voice. So now everyone is confident enough to just speak by themselves. Even if we try to create that culture, people may feel a bit uncomfortable to go to their manager and say, I feel you treated me like this or this happened. This affinity group will help them to raise the voice as a group. So hopefully the business will be able to identify those things easier and to be able to fix them, because that's a very important part. Affinity groups are not there to fix the stuff. The business needs to fix it. The leadership needs to fix it. I need to fix it. Everyone working in the business needs to fix it. Not the affinity groups. They are not there to fix what has been done wrong. They are there to support each other, help each other, identify their own experiences, and give the feedback if they feel comfortable to the business for us to fix it.
They need to be empowered to take that information somewhere, right? So that you can't just be like, oh, okay, well, we've got a load of affinity groups. They meet up, they have a load of speakers, and they actually need to feel like they're contributing and have a channel to communicate upwards or across or somewhere to do something about it.
Exactly. So, for example, every time I do anything inclusion and diversity related, when we update the strategy, we create the toolkits, we implement, I share it with them and I ask them for a challenge. Tell me what it is, like, does this work, doesn't work? Look at it from your experience. Tell me what is not working in there, because I cannot represent everyone. Of course, I don't have the background and the experiences that other people has. And I think one beautiful thing as well about the way the affinity groups are at Innocent is that they all decided to create their own allyship structure. So all the affinity groups decided that they created a group for the members, but also parts of the activities are connecting with allies and speaking with other people on their experiences. So that's, again, another great opportunity for the business to create those connections. And I think what is really important is affinity groups working with each other. As you were saying, this is quite a boxing exercise. Like, you can be a woman and have a disability or be from any minority. So another thing we are very keen to have is our affinity groups working with each other and coping with pride each other. And probably you experience the same, Nadia, but something that really frustrates me is when inclusion and diversity becomes almost like a war between one versus the other. So, no, this is more important. No, this is more important. Or this is way worse than this. And there's no need for that. Like, we all benefit from inclusion. We all benefit from diversity. So having the different affinity groups connecting and working with each other and copying each other instead of kind of creating a competition, I think is really important as well.
Yeah. So how then do we overcome? Because this naturally leads on to the conversation around white men who typically don't have an affinity group. Okay. And there are, for example, people who don't have a disability. They don't typically have an affinity group. Okay. So how do we overcome that element of backlash almost? It's like, oh, okay, well, we've got all these groups. There's nothing for me. I don't fit into any of these groups. So you're not hearing my voice now. What do you say to that?
I think my answer will be the affinity groups is not the full inclusion and diversity strategy. I think it is understanding that what we're trying to achieve here is to have an inclusive environment. An inclusive environment is to allow you to be yourself and actually not only be allowed, but being valued to be yourself, because you're bringing a specific different perspective. And each of us have a specific and different perspective. Each of us has a different way of communicating, of being, of adding value. And you can be the most privileged person in this world. You still have your own way and your own perspectives. So creating an environment which is inclusive for all is actually inclusive for you as well.
I love that. For me, when I hear that, there is an element, I suppose, quite honestly, of wanting to explain that structural disadvantage in society, that our society, organizations are designed for the majority group, by the majority group. So therefore, when any policy is designed or any initiative is taking place, it's typically designed for those people in mind. And so what we're trying to do is get those people who sit in the minority. It doesn't mean that those people who are in the majority groups aren't as important or that their views aren't as necessary to hear, but simply that by default, their views are naturally heard. Their lens that we see the world is typically through their eyes. It doesn't mean we can't learn anything from them. It just means that typically, because we understand less those of an ethnic group and their lived experiences, or we understand less the female because there are less female at senior levels. And so the way that the structure and the systems are designed isn't necessarily for them. That's why it's important to hear those views and ensure that it is inclusive of all. It's a really tough conversation to have.
It is, and it's also helping understand, as you're very well saying, Nadia, your voices are already being heard, but also the richness of you starting to hear other voices. So the richness of you starting to understand other perspectives that you haven't had the experience to live, and how much you as a person can grow and can learn from those experiences. And not only, of course, in the professional life, in the outside space as well, like for your personal life, trying to understand other perspectives and learn from others is super rich. Like it really creates a different perspective. Now, it has its challenges as well. We all start doubting ourselves much more, right? And the moment you start thinking about biases, you start triple thinking. And for people like me, who I overthink things way too much, that is always a challenge. Am I being fair here? Or is this my bias? And you start like questioning yourself more and more, and you have to be ready for that.
Yes, absolutely. I catch myself all the time going, "Oh, was I inclusive when I did that or said that?" Yeah, that's good. I think that's a good thing. It's just a little bit unsettling. Whereas before, I might have just said with confidence and not even looked back at what I'd said. But now I'm reflecting much, much more, having worked in this space. So tell me, you've developed a process at Innocent for measuring progress in diversity and inclusion. Can you just explain, because this is an area that I think a lot of organizations struggle with, is, okay, so we understand things need to change, but how do we know where we're at, and how do we know where we need to be, and how do we measure that?
I guess the first thing is how we got there in terms of the journey we put in place before the measuring. And it's the first thing was to learn about inclusion and diversity, what it is that it means. And we had a lot of learning from the inside and the outside. So from the very beginning, we started gathering data, internal data of what inclusion and diversity is at Innocent. So not only we had external expertise, learning what it means for society and what are the tools that are out there, but also at Innocent, what is our current diversity? What is our current feeling of inclusion from everyone? So we created this inclusion and diversity survey, as many other companies, that we started putting in place, and it measured not only the diversity characteristics, but also the feelings of inclusion. And with the feelings of inclusion, I mean your own. So how included you feel, how value or how much you can give your own perspective, but also what you think the company is with others, how inclusive you think the company is. And we gather all that data. And what we do is, in terms of diversity, we compare the diversity characteristics that we have in the business with the diversity characteristics out there. And I guess what we speak about is what are the focus areas. So what we don't want to do is we don't want to be picking and choosing. Okay, we are going to have this beautiful target about female, and this is going to be our focus area. What we want to do is to assess what are the areas that we have more work to do on? What are the highest priorities looking at the information? So we use that diversity data to compare with the country, and in the cases of cities like London, with the city characteristics. And where we see the biggest difference on diversity characteristics inside and outside is the areas that we have more work to do. In terms of inclusion, what we do is we look at the overall numbers, how inclusive people believe we are being for themselves and others, but also those trends about inclusion and diversity. So does people with certain diversity characteristics feels less included? So we assess that as well, and then we create the action plans based on those priority areas. And then is the action plans measures of success that we have to think. So for the alternative, for the tools we use, what are those measures of success? How do we want those numbers to be changing? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. In fact, it sounds very similar, actually, our cultural inclusion diagnostic, which allows that insight into how people are feeling from an individual perspective in terms of inclusion, in a team perspective, from their manager and senior leaders, and also from an organizational perspective, and then allows you to cut that data by different demographic groups. So it's a really powerful. So you're going to run that, or do you run it multiple times, like every year or every couple of years?
Yeah, we're doing them every year. I think it's the third year this year. So we're doing it every year, and we compare year on year the numbers and what the activities are.
Are you able to share kind of what's on the horizon? What are you focusing? What's the biggest challenge from an inclusion and diversity perspective? And what have you got on your mind for 2021-22?
So in terms of what it is on the way, I guess it's continue the journey we started in terms of identifying what are the tools that will help us the most as a business. We have good number of initiatives from even before we started speaking about inclusion and diversity, and a good number of initiatives that were helping us. But how do we make more of those? How do we speak more about it externally as well? We have this new brand narrative that we call it Little Drinks, Big Dreams. And this is an example of that. How can we, just a smoothie and juice company, help society to develop more and to help more? So being a little bit more external with the things we do is one of the areas that we want to focus on. We have to continue improving. I think we have more work to do on our recruitment processes and make them more diverse and attracting more diverse set of candidates and making sure that the affinity bias is not there. I think we have more work to do on that. And in terms of the biggest challenges that you were asking me, I think two come to my head. One is to make sure we don't make this a numbers game. Of course, it's important to hire more diversity. Of course, it's important to look at the numbers and measure success. But true success comes from hiring people and making the environment such that they can succeed. So it's not only about the numbers, it's about creating that real culture of adding value with yourself and being yourself inside the company. And I guess the other challenge is keep strong on the needs to understand each other's perspectives. And you will probably agree with me on there is this tension again. We were speaking about tensions, these tensions of some people misinterpreting the fact that it's important to think about how others feel and how your actions and your words can impact others. And some people reading that as being too politically correct. That's a challenge because you need to make people understand that words matter and the feelings of others matter. And sometimes you will not get it because it's not your experience, but that's not being politically correct. That's being emotionally savvy, I guess. And that's one of the risks, people thinking that it's being too politically correct. And the other one is people being scared to talk. So because of that feeling of politically correctness, people being scared to give their perspectives and therefore not getting involved into the conversation.
Totally. I'm really with you. And that's one of the biggest barriers, I would say, particularly for leaders, that I hear them saying, oh, there's this fear of what if I get it wrong? And yeah. Oh my goodness, Marta, I could continue chatting to you for ages. Thank you so much for your time.
It's been a pleasure, Nadia.
So for anyone who's interested, how can they get hold of you? How can they learn more?
I'm in LinkedIn. It's probably the easiest way to connect with me. And I love speaking about this topic. I could speak with you, Nadia, for hours. And if anyone has any ideas, any thoughts, or anything that they think that me or Innocent can help them with, I will be really happy to connect and speak about it. Yes, absolutely.
Amazing. Well, everything that Marta and I spoke about today is available on our show notes page, which is avenirconsultingservices.com under podcasts. So Marta, thank you. I will look forward to catching up with you and hearing more about the Innocent Journey soon.
Thank you very much, Nadia. Pleasure.
That concludes episode 13 of the Why Care podcast. I love Marta's passion for her inclusion and diversity work. She shared some incredible tips and advice for organisations looking to overcome bias, measure their culture and create greater inclusion. It's inspiring to hear what Innocent have achieved in the space of inclusion and diversity in actually a relatively short space of time. Do let Marta and I know what you thought of today's show. You can find me on LinkedIn, Twitter and Instagram with the handle @Nadia and @Avenir Consulting Services. As always, I really appreciate your support of this podcast through leaving a review on whatever platform you're listening and spreading the word by sharing it with your friends and family. Huge thanks to Mauro Kenji for editing this podcast and John Rice for supporting with the show notes and getting it out there on social media.